Cool. So, welcome back to Catapult Your Career, where we delve into the reality of various careers and explore practical advice for numerous professions. And today, we're going to be looking into the world of a developer or software programming. And I have none other than a good friend of mine, Daniel Flint, to join us today. How are you, Daniel?
Yeah, I'm really good. Thanks, Michael. Yourself?
Yes, I'm good. I'm good. I've got me cup of tea, got me water. I've had a cheeky gym workout. I'm flying. I'm happy. I'm happy man. And in order to kind of preface or go into this, it'd be great if you could share just a bit of background about yourself, Daniel, and we can kind of delve into the world of software programmer or developer to kind of help our listeners today.
Sure. So I guess as a brief description of what I do, it's obviously all linked with programming and development of systems or software that people will hopefully use and make their lives easier. And I think there's also a lot of other stuff that goes around that. So there's not just physically, creating program. There's also making sure that the server that it's on is up to scratch. It's got everything it needs. It's, if you're building a website, that it's being presented correctly to everyone across the internet. There's a whole host of things and what I would describe as like infrastructure and kind of like architecture planning that you have to kind of think about at the same time. So it's just all about how different computers talk to each other and ultimately how that helps your end product do what it needs to do.
Nice. Yeah, no, I like that, and it's obviously from the outsider in, and I'll put myself in this bracket. It can be you hear the word, and you kind of get scared. You think, bloody hell, what's all that? What's all that involved? And I love the way you worded it, just making different systems speak together. It's not too different to a previous background. Obviously, myself in project management is kind of just basically getting different people to talk together to create an outcome, and it's no different to what you said really there, I suppose, with different systems, is it?
Yeah, exactly that.
And I suppose what you kind of said, like I've said developer, and I've even said software programmer. I suppose there's are there different kind of are the titles interchangeable? I suppose if someone's looking at like applying to get into this world of kind of software engineer, etc., it's good to kind of get rid of some of the abbreviations and the terminology that always kind of alienates us. So, what could you give us a bit more background about some of the terms? I suppose.
Yeah, for sure. So I think there's a lot of different titles that you might see in job ads. For example, anything ranging from programmer to software engineer to software developer to just developer. Or I think my official title is something like information systems developer, which just means nothing. So I think there's all kind of things that you could be searching for. Particularly, I think the key term I would search for is developer, because I think engineer you could end up building bridges. So there's a there's a that would be what I would suggest. And I think as well, I think the important thing if you're looking to get into the role is to understand that the role can be quite all encompassing. Like what I've described now, some people who are in the industry may think, well, what you've described is actually almost like a team of people. We have our software engineers who write the software. We have our infrastructure guys who make sure the computers talk to one another. And we have our quality assurance department who test it and make sure it works right. So depending on the size of the company you're joining and the kind of maturity, I suppose, of their development team may affect actually what your duties are. For where I am currently, we only really have me. So I kind of fulfill all of those roles to some degree. But in other companies I've worked for, I've literally just been in my lane and said, this is the bit that I do. And then I pass it on to the next person. So it really does depend on the company. And I think if you're applying for these kind of jobs or looking into it, I think you really wouldn't really know that until you started speaking to someone on those kind of first phone interviews and things like that. And you can kind of probe when they say, oh, do you have any questions for me? That's kind of when you might lean in and say, oh, what, if they haven't already described it, you might ask what kind of technology are they using? Is it something that you're familiar with? What kind of team size they have currently. If they say, oh, we've got a team of 3, then you might expect to be doing a few of a bit of everything. If they say, oh, we've got a team of 30, you might assume, okay, that's probably split into, front end, back end, DBAs, QA, all kinds of roles. And obviously, depending on the type of company, they may not have any front end developers because they don't build websites. They may have data engineers or data scientists who all flow into this bracket of writing code, producing results. I was going to say software, but not necessarily. And yeah, so it's. I'd like to say it's not a minefield, but it probably is. If you're completely fresh faced to it, it might be a bit overwhelming for sure.
Yeah, and thank you for kind of sharing that with us. And I think that is the pure premise of this podcast, really, to kind of delve into various careers, whether it's lawyers, teachers, the typical professions, or such like yourself, which is, I would say, a massive growth in terms of kind of the code and developer space in the last kind of 5 or even last decade. I would say is a massive growth, and I think it's really interesting because people, you know, it's a shame, but people, they often do what they can see, and if they don't know about these roles and jobs, they might have an amazing expertise and skill set to suit it, but if they don't know about it, then they're not going to go for it. And I really love your piece you said about like the different kind of types of organisation because, you know, depending on what you are, I suppose a lot of people say is if you're looking to become an entrepreneur or CEO, best place to join is a small business like under 10 people because you do everything. Whereas if you have a clear kind of goal or role in mind in terms of I want to be a specialist in X field of developing, like you said, you might join a bigger corporation or bigger organisation because your bread and butter will be purely just doing that lane. And when you mentioned, say, if you're in a big organisation, the different lanes, it'd be interesting to kind of myth bust or kind of get some understanding around those definitions of, like you said, the front end, back end. Could you kind of give a bit more information around what some of those different lanes might be and what they actually are, I suppose, to a layman like me?
Yeah, sure. So if we just take website development as an example, because you can kind of apply the structure across anything really, because pretty much every piece of software you use will have this layering, whether or not it's web-based or not. But it's often, because web-based development is so popular and it's everywhere, it's more kind of common, I suppose. But so at the very bottom level, bottom is not necessarily in terms of hierarchy, but I think of it in terms of the system structure. So
Yeah.
the base of the system, that would be where the data is stored and managed. So when someone views your comments on Facebook, those comments are stored somewhere, and that it needs to be read and passed up through the chain. So the first level is going to be what they call DBAs, or database administrators. Sometimes they can have other names related to data because in the modern world, databases can be all kinds of different pieces of software that some would argue are not true databases. Potentially, I'm not sure, but the idea there is that you would be someone who is literally on an administration level of the data. So you would be writing the queries required to serve that data forward. You might be asked to say, oh, how many sales did we make last week? And then you might have to then look at the data and figure out, add up all your sales. So it's the kind of, that's where I kind of started. That was where I first found my niche, if you like, is with data. So that's kind of the database admin, and there are also performance implications there as well, because if the database is returning information slowly, it slows everything else above it down. So there's everyone's got to have an important role in the service. So it's not necessarily not important in terms of the software at the end or anything like that. But that's kind of the root layer, and then above that you have what people call the back end, which is effectively the part no one visually sees, but it's the part that the computer does all the number crunching. So it'll take those sales figures and it'll say, right, I'll split them into regions, or I'll split those into salespersons, or I'll understand that every Tuesday we don't take sales, so I'll discount that Tuesday, for example. So there's all this kind of business logic and understanding that the back end does. It's more of that's where I think most software engineers would place themselves. It's the kind of part that people don't see, but all the number crunching is done, if you like.
Yeah.
And then the final layer is the front end development. And this is the part that everyone does see. This is the part that people interact with, and this is the part where it kind of arches into sort of even human psychology and things like that. Because then you have things like what they call UX, which is user experience, and also like the actual designing, so the graphic designing of the front end. So you could be working in a software team, but your role is actually an artist because you are designing the graphics and the look of the website, and then you pass it to the front end developer, and he or she looks at that template you've drawn effectively, and then has to recreate that in their HTML and CSS code. So and then so the front end sits on top of the back end, and the back end says we had this many sales by this many people, and it was the front end will then receive that information and say, well, how do I best display? And then you could imagine, for example, something like an Excel table where it's like
Yeah.
per person and the sales, and that's kind of the iterative process, and that's your typical kind of structure. There can be other roles, like I described before about data engineers and data scientists, and they would sit the kind of, if we're going up the scale to get to front end, they would kind of sit at a negative layer to the DBA, because they're not really dealing with the website per se. They may be dealing with, in an engineer's case, they might work in tandem with the DBA or even be the DBA, in a sense that they're kind of structuring the data. When you've got so much of it, it's important that it's structured and stored correctly. So there's an entire job just for that. And then on the opposite side, when you get to like the reporting layer, that's where your scientists or analysts would kind of be interpreting that information, applying machine learning models to project sales or any kind of stuff like that. So there's a whole breadth of things, and all of these roles involve programming languages in some sense, and each role will obviously be utilizing different types of languages. And I don't know if we need to get that far into it. I'm holding myself back from getting too involved, but I think that's kind of a typical kind of structure in a development world. And you can see how there are still distinct boxes that you might want to place yourself in, depending if you're more creative. You may feel that front end development's for you. If you're more logical, potentially, you might find that back end development is actually where you might want to place yourself. So there's all kinds of bits and bobs to kind of get involved with.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. That, I can only speak for myself. It's you see so many of these names chucked out that just that little kind of cycle you've done through the roles that it's so valuable, because like I've definitely seen a UX designer. I've definitely seen that a lot of times, and yeah, obviously user experience. It kind of makes perfect sense really in terms of how people interact with the systems, and it's no wonder. Why this space has grown because of from the the explanations you've given, because at the end of the day most businesses make decisions based on data. They want to make informed decisions. You don't kind of put your finger in the wind and think, right, this might do well. And especially with the kind of growth of kind of online in terms of websites, I know that's kind of very much a few decades ago. It was only going to be a natural progression to go to this space and have this industry boom, because now you can get all that data. It kind of, you can see, right, you're going to have people right from the certain kind of back end level to the front end level to, yes, let's make sure integrity and the structure of the system works and it's giving us what we need. But equally, for those who don't need to know that, the outsider, it's going to be visually appealing. It's going to make them. I love the kind of delve into human psychology. You see that a lot in supermarkets. There's a reason why when you go to Primark or whoever, you have your little £2 socks and you go, oh, I might need them when you're waiting in the queue, and you pick them up. It's all done on purpose. Even the kind of colours of labels, it's all done on purpose to kind of trick the mind and encourage you into kind of buying behaviour or the behaviour the company wants. So it's no wonder this industry is absolutely boomed, And from your perspective, obviously you said the different lanes, which has kind of hopefully been quite visual and helpful for those who are listening. Obviously, you're a one man band. You do the whole thing. So, how does it work in practice for you? Are you a little bit of, I suppose, a bit of everything, a bit of the DBA, the data, you're a bit of the back end, and equally a bit of the front end, or do you still liaise with kind of other departments?
Yeah, so I mean, we're quite lucky now that we have got a front end developer now. So that's definitely my weakest side, because I'm not a particularly artistic person. I can build a functional website, but it'll look horrific. So it's nice to have someone else who I can say, can you please, make this not look bad? So, and just to say as well, it just made me think of the term that sometimes you may see the words full stack developer appear, and that is basically someone is expecting you to be the whole department. They're expecting you to do the full suite. So, would I describe myself as full stack? I probably wouldn't, because I'm lacking on that front end part. But I guess from back end development down, that's kind of where I like to be. So all the way down through to the data science and data manipulation, that kind of thing. So yeah, really, I suppose my career began through data analytics, which is why I'm more focused down that side, I suppose. But what I do now is, I was originally, when I accepted the job, it was kind of we need someone to build a data warehouse, and we need it to be able to deliver these reports in a timely manner. Is that something you can do? Yeah, that's what I can do. So, that was my first job, if you like, when employed, was to go through and produce this warehouse and this structure and all that kind of stuff. And then after that, it kind of grew, but I always knew the intention was always, right, this is your first task, but after that, there's going to be other things there's going to be future developments we're going to want to do. Like, can you also work on those sort of things? So I don't want to make it sound like I was just shocked when these requests came through, but then,
No.
Things come up and they say, can we have a system that does this, like room bookings? Can we have a system that can automate communications between our IT service desk and our server monitoring? And, there's all these kind of bits that just kind of crop up that you kind of get involved in. So I would say definitely my focus has always been more on data movement, and also the kind of back end development because effectively that is, again, it's structuring and processing information, really, that's doing. It's just more linked with the actual application, rather than just when you look at data from a data perspective, you can kind of look at it fairly neutrally and say, this is what it should look like because it's good, if that makes any sense. It's best practice for the data. But actually, when the client gets it, and this could be your website, this could be your phone app, this could be whatever it is, it will look at it and be like, well, that means nothing to me. I need something to tell me what all this is. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, it's I suppose it is interesting, and I suppose one thing you've touched on there is around self-awareness, and I think I suppose my kind of the key element, if you were to ask what a coach does for people, is to increase their self-awareness and kind of guide, support, and challenge them to actually take action on that. So even what you said, you had a self-awareness around the data analytics side, and that kind of yes, right, that's great. Now I know that. Now how am I going to action it? Well, I'm going to target certain roles that kind of incorporate that skill set. And I always make this kind of crass example or joke, but the whole kind of, I don't know if you've ever watched Suits. Have you watched Suits?
I haven't, no.
Oh, okay, you're missing out. But it's basically, as it says, Suits. It's about lawyers, and it's very kind of dramatized, and it makes them look like they live the higher life and all the rest of it. And you would think, oh, I love that kind of lifestyle. I love that kind of, out there talking, confrontation, challenges, and all the rest of it. And you think, okay, this is a job I want to go to or to do. But I have a couple of lawyer friends, and if you kind of delve more into the reality of that career, it's a whole lot of research, a whole lot of kind of looking up cases and reviews before you get your 5-10 minutes of fame in the courtroom and going through kind of the spiel, I suppose. And if you apply for that job, you'd soon realise if your skill set or interests were different, you think, crikey, I don't want to be doing this stuff. This is naff. So I think it's really important, like you've just done yourself, to like have self-awareness of what you like, and equally, maybe even more importantly, what you don't like, because then you can avoid that. So and say, right, I'll park that. I'm going to be looking at these kind of roles. So I suppose for someone, we've kind of delved into various different bits and a little bit about your job. I suppose it's very hard. It's always a tricky question, and you kind of touched on the surface level of this, but what does like the average week look like for you? I suppose the average day I always think is too tricky, but the average week, what would Daniel be doing, say, in a couple of weeks' time, in terms of your role?
Sure. So I'm going to do my best to not get too involved because I appreciate for anyone who's non-technical, I'm not. It's not that someone wouldn't understand, but it's just potentially very boring, and that's what I'm always very conscious of.
Well,
Um,
don't be so presumptuous, Daniel. There
um,
will be people who are interested in this world, so you never know. You
well,
never know.
that's true. That's true. But so I guess a typical week for me is basically managing projects. So there would be a lot of different things going on. So let's just, we can create a few things that might be happening. For example, the data warehouse. Maybe there's a new report that needs creating. So it's kind of okay. There would be writing some SQL queries. There'd be pulling that data into Power BI. There'd be turning that into bar charts and pie charts and things that people would like to look at visually. Um, then I may have another project going on. We talked about a booking app. Perhaps we need to add something new to the booking app. We need to be able to book buses this week. So we have to figure out how do we store bus data? Um, how do we know whether a bus is booked already or not? Does the bus need to have an option to be a double decker? All this kind of stuff. So it's understanding what kind of features you need to implement. And then there might be something like, oh, well, we need this integration in place, like we were talking about, between the
Mm.
service desk and the um, monitoring system. So maybe we need to create a piece of middleware, an API that receives a notification from the server to say, I've run out of memory, please add extra disk space to my server, and then it can push that and make the service desk make a pop-up that say, service desk people, don't forget this server needs some more disk space. So
Mm.
there's all kinds of things that you could be doing, and it sounds a bit whimsical to say it's the possibilities are endless, but I suppose with
Mm.
any role they are. But I think the crux of it comes down to understanding that you've got multiple work streams coming in. Each thing requires your attention, and being able to prioritize based on how long a job may take and that the required deadline as well. Fortunately, I can say I don't have particularly tight deadlines currently, which makes my life a lot easier. But I know in some places you can be, it can be quite strict that, oh, we need this feature done by the end of the month, for example. And I suppose alongside all that is also managing what they call version control, which is encompassed by everything. So all of those projects would have a level of version control, and understanding that when a feature is completed to pull that version in. So the way version control works, I haven't really given a lot of context there, is you may have like the main, they call it main or master branch, and that's kind of like your copy that everyone uses. And then you may decide, okay, well, we've got booking app, this is what it looks like, it's the main version of it, but now we need to add buses. So we make a branch and make the buses feature on a completely independent version of it, so that the actual main copy isn't disturbed. And then when you're ready and you're happy with buses, you then merge it back in, and then everyone starts using buses, and because it works. So it's that kind of flow of understanding as well, making sure that. And the reason you would do that is it's not because it's a live code set that you can't possibly touch the main one because everyone's is going to break it. It's more that if you need to push a change, let's say there's a bug in the main one that you didn't know about, you need to quickly fix it. It means it's easy for you to push out that bug fix without also pushing out half of the bus feature that you have yet to finish. It's kind of about keeping things organized in that way.
Mm.
So that's another kind of, I guess, task. But yeah, I think really the crux of the job is kind of what I was saying before about understanding your work streams and working to achieve that, really.
Yeah, and I mean, you started also as well. Like you kind of spoke about some of the tasks that a developer, an average week would look like for you. But you almost started to delve into like the skills, like and the
Mm.
abilities that would be quite helpful. And I wonder if you could kind of be good to kind of go a bit more into detail into that as well. So if someone has heard or listening today and is interested into going into this world, and whether it's front end, back end, the various roles you kind of identified, you it's clear to see you have to be incredibly kind of detail orientated, very practical, very logical in terms of the way you're thinking. Everything you kind of talk about is in steps. It's like this is the
Hmm.
first step, and it's the second step. Even the version control is very kind of logical in terms of how you go through it. What do you think in terms of firstly skills? Let's touch on skills first. What are some of the key skills you think a developer needs really to kind of do their role?
Sure. I think in terms of like, I don't know if this is what soft skills are, but in terms of like your generic like attributes a person should have, I think what you
Mm,
just described is pretty spot on. I think being logical is important, and the reason for that is computers are logical. They only tell
mm,
you only do what you tell them to do. So you need to make sure what your instructions are logical and achieve what you're trying to set out to do. Um, and I think obviously important in any role is this kind of time management, understanding of priorities. In some places, you may find you're at that level almost micromanaged because you'll be assigned tasks and given deadlines. And yes, you still need to achieve them in that time frame, but it's much easier to keep track of what you need to do. Whereas if you're in a smaller company and you're the only point of contact, you may need to find you're managing that yourself. So that kind of time
yeah.
management is quite important. Um, and I think, you know, really it's about understanding, depending on the kind of complexity. I don't think that's fair to say, actually. It's not the complexity of the role, it's depending on the nature of the role. So, for example, we talked a little bit about the front end and how being creative is obviously beneficial to that, understanding colors and human nature, that kind of thing. So, those are the kind of things that are important for that. But it's also depending on where you would like to place yourself. It's making sure that you've got an understanding of the technology at that level, and also the kind of languages that are used at that level as well. So, for example, the front end developer, the three core things they're going to need to know is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And those three, they're not all programming languages. I don't want to get, if anyone technical read me was listening and heard me call HTML a programming language, they would probably hang me. But the idea there is that if you understand those three core concepts and understand how those work, that is kind of the core of that role. And yes, there are things that kind of build on those. That there are things called frameworks which utilize those things, but in a different way, that you may need to learn. So, for example, you may see someone talk about the React framework or the Vue framework, and it's kind of like, well, if you can still do HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, you'll be fine. Like, you just need to figure out that different way of working to fit that niche, because different companies work in different ways. And then in the same on the back end, I think it becomes a little bit more broader, because if you're working with data specifically, you may actually think, SQL or SQL is pretty much core for you at that point. Arguably, it's probably core for any back-end developer, but not necessarily. If you're working on very low-level systems, like let's say you're developing for Windows and you're making the operating system, the type of languages you're going to use there, for example, would be something like C or Rust, which what they call low-level languages, tend to be a little more difficult to learn for beginners because they're quite intense. And then you have what are called like higher level languages, something like Python, or Perl or something like that, which tend to be easier to learn, because what happens is these languages, they kind of have a support system around them. When you install them on your computer, it kind of takes what you've typed and then almost transcribes it in this. So Python effectively, it's very nice and easy to read, in my opinion. So it's very easy to learn. But once you've written your bit, what happens is the Python compiler takes that and then translates it into C at some level. And there's a lot of some stuff's in pure Python, but a lot of the faster stuff is written again into C for you, and then it runs it in C effectively. So there's there's some languages that basically take some level of the real kind of guts of the computer away from you and kind of give you a bit more of a higher level access
Yeah.
point, which can make the roles different. Because for a lot of what I do, I don't need to work with C or Rust. Sometimes I do, out of choice, because I feel like it's the best option. But actually, a lot of the time, it's a quick thing. We just need to get these two systems talking to each other. Python's perfectly fine. In this case, that's what we should use, kind of thing. So I think understanding which languages, I guess, that you'd like to learn because you're interested in them, and then also understanding what is popular and in demand for those roles, I think is important as well. Um,
Yeah.
so I think, well, at the risk of going off on a tangent, Michael, I'm thinking of talking a little bit about getting into the role. Um,
Perfect. Please, that was going to be my follow-up question because you mentioned some of the different languages and the different kind of things there, and I'm thinking, they almost kind of slot nicely into front end, back end in terms of different roles you want to do. I was just going to say exactly that. You mentioned some of the high level soft skills that are quite needed to get into that role. So if whether you've done personality quizzes or skills or kind of done occupational questionnaires, Myers-Briggs, all these different things, they often give us information. So if you're a listener, you identify with some of the skills we mentioned, that's obviously a good start. But I suppose, go on. It'd be great to go on to now some of the more practicalities of if someone likes what they've heard, how would they actually go about getting into the industry?
yeah, and I think the magic of this for me is that it's very accessible, and the benefit of this kind of work, I suppose, is unlike something like working on an oil rig where you really kind of have to go there to figure out if you like it or not. You're going to need to try it first. And trying it is quite an intense process. Whereas with software development, if you have a computer, you can try it straight away. Because a lot of the stuff people use, even in industry, is open sourced, it's free to use at home. So, I mean, I guess from my perspective, what happened. So when I was at university, I actually studied marine ecology, which is not computer science or anything related to software. But what I was doing was using a language called R. And what that was doing was it was all about, so at the time, it was about statistical modeling for fisheries management. So how many fish do we have? Can we fish this many kilos or tons? And what would happen if we did? What's the projection of the population? Let's make sure we still have fish in the future, basically.
Yeah.
And that was the kind of stuff that I was really enjoying with, and I quite liked working with R. And it kind of went from there. And I thought, you know what? Turns out that marine ecology, there's not many roles in the UK. I don't really want to go abroad. And for me, what I actually was enjoying most is actually the kind of data side. So let's have a look and get into data analytics. And it kind of went from there. And I went from analyst to DBA to kind of onwards to sort of more software stuff. And I think so. There's a lot of good entry points, and the way I got into it was basically by learning and teaching myself at home because there's
Mm.
so many resources online for how to install these languages, program with these languages, get started. There's YouTube tutorials, there's paid services like Udemy, which I found very helpful. There's all kinds of things, Code Academy, many resources. It's not difficult to find them for sure. And I think it's a case of having a look at something and saying, well, maybe in my spare time, I might try and build a calculator and just see how you get on, see what you think. And you might think, actually, yeah, that was good fun. Or I'm going to build a website. I think that'd be quite a big ask for someone who's just starting out. But, if you want to hit the ground running, then maybe that's somewhere to go. And you can maybe even look at, well, what if I wrote some HTML and CSS and I opened it in Google Chrome? How would it look? Because you could do that. You can just open it in Google Chrome and think, well, that looks pretty good. Actually, let me move that box down a bit, change your HTML, and then it will move. So it's very accessible in my opinion. And I think in terms of if I was going to make suggestions of where to start, I think for anyone interested in the front end stuff, I would say definitely get into grips with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and probably doing what I just described. writing it yourself, opening the files in Chrome, and just doing that as a kind of tester and see what you think, and then try to. It would be, I guess, difficult for you maybe because it. Oh, well, I say difficult. I was thinking like then you might decide, well, let me add a search feature to my website. I've got the nice look. Let me put a search bar somewhere and make it look good. You could definitely do that, but you wouldn't be able to actually search anything. So there, I would
Yeah.
find that difficult because my brain would be like, well, it needs to work. It must function. But really, if you're just doing the design, then that's absolutely fine, and that's kind of what you would aim for. And I think learning uh, those three things, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, are the core things and really good. And if you were going to look a little bit deeper, there is
Hmm.
something called jQuery, which is kind of like an expansion pack, if you like, of JavaScript, which makes life a lot easier. So I would recommend that be something that you look into and understand. And as a beginner, as well as a good framework for front end, which a lot of people use in the industry, called Bootstrap. So jQuery and Bootstrap are your friends if you're starting out, to get used to those kind of things, because it really helps apply a structure to what you're doing and make it easy to follow. And I think in terms of the back end stuff, I would always recommend Python as a starting point for two main reasons. One, I believe it is quite easy to. It's one of those things. It's easy to get on board with it, but there's still a high ceiling for mastery. It's difficult to master, if you like. Um, so it's a great entry point, and it'll be one of those things that you start in a year, and then you look back at the code you wrote 6 months ago, and you think, God, that looks horrific. What was I thinking? That was so unorganized, and I could make that so much better now. So I think don't worry too much about making it perfect to start with, because you learn by doing, for sure. Um, so yeah, I definitely recommend Python as a starting point. And there's there's a few things with programming where so Python is what they call dynamically typed. So when I say something in programming is where you define a variable. So my variable number of sales equals one, and that's how many sales I have, for example. In Python, you don't need to tell it that one is a number. It just kind of knows. It's like, well, that's a number. Cool. I'll deal with that. If you use something like C or Rust, you have to say number of sales is a number, and this number can hold this much space. It's not a one-digit number; it's a two-digit number. It's not quite that granular, but for
Yeah.
for understanding's sake, you need to specify how much space this number takes up, and that can be a bit daunting. So I think if you wanted to kind of ease yourself into that world, there's a language called C sharp, which is very accessible, and it works great on Windows because Microsoft kind of build it.
Yeah.
So it's kind of an easy one to get to grips with, and that is what they call a statically typed language, where you do have to say this is a number, this is a string, but it's also quite forgiving as well.
Yeah.
So that would be what I would suggest as a starting point, is kind of understanding where you'd like to look. Maybe pick a language that you can see, and I think as well, one other thing you can do is you might. I'm saying use Python. It's very popular, which is true now, but maybe next year they release an update to Python that completely nukes the popularity, and everyone starts using Go instead. And it's kind of like, well, you can look as well at job adverts and understand which languages people are needing in your area or where you're looking to work. If you're thinking, I'm going to work at Facebook, no point learning Python if you want to work at Facebook because they use something else. So
Yeah.
that's kind of, I guess, another thing as well. You can kind of look at the market and understand what's in demand, and take that and kind of start to learn it. And I think, as I said, I think it's quite an accessible thing to do. I suppose the only thing I would mention is you need somewhere to write all this stuff. And if you're brand new, you may not know where to start. So I would just suggest there's something called Visual Studio Code. It's very different to just plain Visual Studio. We don't like to name things too simply. But Visual Studio Code is a free text editor, if you like. They call it an IDE, Integrated Development Environment. But basically, it means you can type your code and you can run it at the same time without too much complication. It kind of makes your life a bit easier. So that's a great way to start. There's many other ones which I'm not going to get involved in because it's just pointless exercise of what, it's kind of like Android versus iPhone. They all do the same
Yeah.
thing. It's what your preference is, but you might find in the future there's other ones you enjoy more. But that's definitely a good place to start if you're completely fresh faced and you have no prior um, kind of knowledge to go off of. Then
Yeah.
start there.
Amazing. And thank you for, I mean, that's a real kind of extensive kind of background, I suppose, into, yes, we covered developers at a high level, some of the soft skills, but equally, if you resonated with a particular area like the front end or back end, some real kind of key actions to kind of go away and actually do and implement, which is amazing. And I suppose to kind of pull our kind of session to it, or our podcast, I suppose, to a close, Daniel, like, obviously you've been kind of in the developer world for a few years now. I'm interested, if you had your kind of time again, say 3, 5 years ago, what would be a piece of advice you would have given yourself before entering that industry and obviously entering the role you are now?
Um, I mean, I would say, I think for me, it would be more about almost your emotional intelligence. I don't want to make it sound like I did everything perfectly because that's not the case. But I feel like my growth journey was quite natural. I
Mm,
kind of self-taught myself and kind of progressed through the industry and just kind of took new roles as I felt more confident. But I think I would the advice I'd give myself if I was speaking to younger me is to not just chase the role and job title you want, but to kind of it's that kind of thought process of the grass isn't always greener. Because I've done a few jobs where I think, God, this company culture is horrendous. This isn't great for me. I don't like X, Y, Z, and I think it's just kind of, and in some of those times, it's impossible to know, isn't it, what you're going to get yourself into. But I think it's just understanding what you've got now. Um,
mm,
but I think, I guess, in a more practical way, I think the best advice that I can give older me, younger me, which I think is advice I was already following, which is just to make sure that you keep on top of your learning. Like keep, even if you're not kind of feeling it. That makes it sound super intense, which it doesn't have to be. But just basically, don't lose track of the fact you do need to keep on top of your skills. And if you don't
yeah.
know a language already, make sure you do learn it and keep on top of it. Because if you don't know that, then you're not employable. So I
Yeah,
think,
that's so true. That is so true. I just quickly on that, you're basically saying like it's around perfectionism, isn't it? If you think you're perfect, the market and everywhere the world will leave you and pass you
mm,
by. And I think, it, especially because you gave an example before already in terms of like, right, Python's the one that everyone's using it, but there's an update, and all of a sudden Python's gone and no one uses it. If you just kind of say, well, no, I'm Mr. Python, and I don't do anything else, then you're just left by within an instant. And I think that is, I mean, there's various things you can do around your values, but one of the reason why I resonate with this point so much is one of my kind of core values is lifelong learning, and I believe that in everything I do. So whether it's the sports I play, whether I like playing golf, I like golf because you can't perfect it, you can always learn. Whether it's being like a coach, I could be 85 and still learn new things about coaching and helping others. I think it's really, really kind of fundamental, that aspect, regardless of what you do, see the goal as learning rather than the goal as being successful. The goal for me is to learn. So if I have failures, all of a sudden, oh, it's not failure, I'm learning something. And it's just such a massive kind of change in mindset, which I think is amazing. Beautiful. So I suppose thank you so much for your time, Daniel, and kind of sharing your kind of knowledge, your experience, and your insight around the world of being a developer. And hopefully that kind of help the listeners who are kind of interested in that kind of career and that pathway. If anybody wants to kind of connect with you and continue this discussion, and they have a question about becoming a developer or what language I should choose, where's the best place to kind of to find you and connect?
yeah, I mean, I would say the best place is LinkedIn. Really, that's kind of a really good professional space, and I'm assuming you'll be able to supply a link or something like that. I'm more than happy for people to connect with me, and if you want to catch up, that's absolutely fine. And I'll constantly checking my messages on there anyway, so you'll definitely get a reply.
Amazing. Yes, I can definitely include a link in the show notes to Daniel's LinkedIn. And yeah, thanks again for your time. Thank you all for listening to another episode of Catapult Your Career, and I will see you on the next one.